Heaven and hell. We're going to have two videos on this. This first one is on the Jerry Walls chapter. Jerry Walls is a Christian writer who has written books on this topic. And he's focusing on sort of moral issues, mainly to do with heaven and hell, and objections on moral grounds and responses to these criticisms by Christian writers. A lot of these arguments could be made by Islamic or Jewish writers too, but he just happens to be from a Christian background. And then in the other video, we're going to talk about metaphysical issues. That is, how is it that something that doesn't have my body can be me in heaven or hell? How is it that I can die on earth and yet somehow continue to exist in heaven or hell? We'll look at that next time. All right, so he starts with hell. And the traditional conception of hell, according to him, consists of three essential claims. All three things have to be true, or are taken to be true, of the traditional conception of hell. The first one is that some people will not be saved. So, in other words, this is the idea that hell is not empty. We'll look, you could call this view, this first proposition, anti-universalism. Because universalism is the view that everybody is saved, that everybody ends up in heaven. So anti-universalism is going to be the view that that's not true. There are some people in hell. Now, a qualifier, I'll just give a qualifier and then kind of ignore it going forward. On one Christian understanding of hell, there's nobody in heaven or hell yet. This, I think, was actually the original traditional understanding, that you die and you're dead and don't exist until the day of judgment. And then on the day of judgment, everybody is judged and then sorted, and then you exist in heaven or hell. And as Walls says, the traditional view is that heaven is on earth. That, as he says, the traditional materialist view of heaven and hell is that we're not disembodied souls existing in some place other than earth. We have our bodies and everything, it's just that they become indestructible. And as he says, he quotes a writer called N.T. Wright. The ultimate future, as chapters 21 and 22 of Revelations, that's the last book of the Bible, make clear, is not about people leaving earth and going to heaven, but rather about the life of heaven, more specifically the New Jerusalem coming down from heaven to earth, exactly in line with the Lord's prayer, if you know the Lord's Prayer, in heaven as it is in earth. This conception of salvation is profoundly at odds with notions of salvation that are exclusively spiritual. That is the idea that our souls are what live on in heaven or hell. So he says that's actually the more traditional Christian conception, that, you know, heaven and hell are both empty, and they will be on earth, or at least heaven will be, and will exist eternally on earth in sort of earthly bodies that are indestructible. That's not what most people think of heaven and hell. I think if we took a poll, the vast majority of people who believe in heaven and hell think of them as that's where Grandpa is right now. You know, if Grandpa died, then Grandpa is looking down on us from heaven, we hope, and not looking up at us from hell. In other words, exists in heaven right now, and so heaven and hell actually have people in them. And I guess we'll kind of take that assumption going forward. But anyway, some people will not be saved. those people who are not saved go to a place called hell, and hell is a miserable place. So this is the key feature stressed by part 2, is that it's unpleasant in hell, and the justification for the unpleasantness is that you are getting it as punishment for your sins. Now, another quick comment. When Jerry Walls specifies number 1, he says some people will never accept the grace of God and therefore will not be saved. So in his description of number 1, he's saying that the reason, the entry requirements for heaven and hell are you get to go to heaven if you accept the grace of God, and presumably on Christian grounds, that is by accepting Jesus. And that's what gets you into heaven. And then what gets you into hell is not doing that. Okay, so this raises a problem that Jerry Walls never actually talks about, which is you can call it the Gandhi problem. And the Gandhi problem is a problem for a Christian view of heaven. If the Christian view of heaven, which is if you accept Jesus, then you get to go to heaven, there's a couple of problems for this. First of all, can you be a completely horrible person and do all kinds of horrible things all your life and then on your deathbed accept Jesus and get to heaven? Whereas if you're Gandhi of course is this widely regarded as a saintly figure for his non-violent form of resistance. He's one of the main reasons that India got its independence from the British Empire, and instead of forming terrorist groups and fighting guerrilla warfare against the colonizers, Gandhi insisted on non-violent resistance. So the British would shoot at crowds of people and they wouldn't shoot back, they would just sit down and not resist. Gandhi, as is well known, was a huge influence on Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King was expressly using Gandhi's tactics in his methods of non-violent resistance. But of course, Gandhi was a Hindu. Interestingly, he converted to Hinduism. He wasn't brought up in Hinduism because he actually grew up in South Africa rather than in India, but he returned to India. He was of Indian heritage. But he definitely became a Hindu and was very much a practicing Hindu for the remainder of his life. So the Gandhi problem is Gandhi in hell? Despite being a saintly figure who practiced, very Jesus-like non-violence and did all these good things, simply because he practices the wrong religion, he has to burn in hell. That is the problem for the view of the entry requirements to heaven simply being accepting Jesus. And in general, I think the colloquial understanding of heaven and hell is different. It's a bit more like, as illustrated in that TV show, The Good Place, where it's based on your deeds. So rather than being based on your faith, what religion you profess, which leads to the Gandhi problem, it's based on your deeds. And I think the popular picture of heaven and hell is if you're good enough, you go to heaven in terms of doing good deeds, and if you're below a cutoff line, you go to hell. There's kind of a mixed message that you get from 1 and 2 in the presentation by Jerry Walls, because he talks about some persons will never accept the grace of God. So you have to accept the grace of God to go to heaven. But then when you're in hell, why are you punished? Well, you're punished for your sins. And presumably by sins, this includes doing bad things like, kicking puppies or whatever, or, much worse things, if you can imagine worse things. So it sounds like then in hell, you're getting punishment for your deeds. Whereas if you go to heaven, it sounds like, on Jerry Wall's presentation of it, someone in heaven could have done much worse things than someone in hell, but because they accepted Jesus, they get to go to heaven and they're not punished for their sins. Whereas these people who have exactly the same number of sins, or perhaps even fewer, are punished for them simply because they didn't accept Jesus. It's kind of a mixed picture. But you can certainly make it consistent. You can say, you can come up with a view of heaven and hell where you get to go to heaven if you're good. So Gandhi goes to heaven. The problem with universalism, which we'll get to in a bit, is, you might say, the Hitler problem. So the Gandhi problem is Gandhi is good, but he's in hell. The Hitler problem is Hitler is bad, but he gets to go to heaven on the view of universalism, which is everybody gets saved. So that's the objection to universalism. All right, but to continue. So we've got some people will end up in hell. Hell is a place of punishment and misery, and there's no escape. No escape ever. I mean, you might say people sentenced to prison for life get no escape from prison, but of course eventually they escape by dying, whereas you can't do that in hell according to the traditional punishment model of hell. You can never get out. Repentance won't get you out. You can't commit suicide. You can't be annihilated, which means go to nothing. There is no exit. You will exist for all eternity. Now, the main problem with the punishment model of hell, and this is an internal criticism. This isn't a criticism from outside of Christian theology. The Gandhi problem, you might say, no, even within Christian thinking, as we've seen in the discussion of inclusivism and exclusivism, that also has the Gandhi problem. I mentioned the Gandhi problem previously in discussing exclusivism. So that is a criticism even from within Christian thinking. But even within Christian thinking, this is a major problem that is discussed. The proportionality problem for punishment view of hell. What does that mean? Well, particularly if someone who's ends up in hell simply because they didn't accept Jesus. Now again, it's not just a problem for Gandhi, because Gandhi, after all, did know about Jesus. He just chose to be Hindu instead. But what about people who've never even heard the good word? Like I said when discussing exclusivism, you know, some people who live in a tribe in the Amazon and they've never encountered Christianity. Are they in hell? And it just seems, or even if you have someone who's committed murder and ends up in hell, it just seems vastly disproportionate that they should be tortured for all eternity. Eternity is a long time. If you think about it, effectively, if you're going to exist for all eternity in the afterlife, heaven or hell, then effectively your time on earth is 0% of your existence. Why? Because any finite amount divided by infinity is effectively 0. Because, of course, fractions get smaller the larger the number is on the bottom. Like 1 over 2, a half, is bigger than 1 over 3, a third, is bigger over 1 over 10, a tenth. So the smallest possible fraction is 1 over infinity, and it approaches so close to 0 as makes no difference. Because, you know, if you think of 1 over a billion, 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 that is incredibly tiny, but it's nothing compared to 1 over infinity. So effectively, if you're going to live forever, your time on earth is 0% of your existence. Anything that you could do in effectively 0% of your existence surely couldn't justify being tortured for all eternity. Kill 100 people. Sure, you should be punished for, I don't know, a few thousand years. But that's nothing. A few thousand years is nothing compared to infinity. Literally nothing. So there's nothing that you could do that seems to merit infinite punishment. Even Hitler doesn't seem to merit infinite punishment. That's the proportionality problem. Because we believe that the punishment should fit the crime. That's actually the idea of the principle called lex talionis, which is an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. Often this is cited as being rather a cruel principle, but actually it was a very progressive principle in the time, during the time of the Old Testament when it was first proposed, because it was to set an upper limit on punishment. That was the idea. You couldn't be killed for stealing a loaf of bread. You can't be torn apart by wild horses for jaywalking. That's the idea of lex talionis. It's to set an upper limit. So if you put someone's eye out, the most that should happen to you is that you should have your eye put out or whatever. This appears to violate the proportionality problem massively. Infinite punishment for finite sins. So, what can you say in response to that? Well, one response is to be a universalist. And in fact, that's what motivates a lot of universalists. Like Rob Bell, for example. I gave you an old excerpt from the New York Times about this Grand Rapids pastor, mega pastor, who wrote a book apparently defending universalism. And it's for, reasons like this, that surely a loving God would not punish people for all eternity. I mean, any punishment, any suffering in hell at all, even if you think it's a limited suffering for doing bad things, like Hitler, we think Hitler or Stalin is a better example, because Hitler at least died in his bunker. Stalin was responsible for more deaths than Hitler, millions of people through starvation, horrible deaths, directly responsible because of policies he instituted, and yet died in his bed while still in power. Nothing bad seemed to happen to him in his life. He got away with it, you might say. So the concepts of heaven and hell seem to be necessary if one believes in the universe as essentially a just place, which presumably one should if we believe that the universe is created by a perfect God. So if we're going to get justice, clearly we don't get it on earth. Horrible things happen to innocent people, often at the hands of horrible people who don't have bad things happen to them. There's great injustices obvious on earth. If we're going to say the scales are eventually balanced out, it seems like they have to be balanced out after death, and hence the idea of heaven and hell. So heaven and hell are often taken, heaven and hell, you might say, have both backwards-looking and forwards-looking justifications. Just like punishment, actually, in theories of punishment, there are many different justifications for punishment, but two of the most prominent are retributivism, which says the function of punishment is to give people what they deserve. And that's where the proportionality principle comes in. Retributivists say your punishment should fit your crime because it's a direct response to what you've done. So that's a backwards-looking justification for punishment. You could say heaven and hell have backwards-looking justification because they're trying to set up justice that is not achieved on earth, because bad people get away with it, good people suffer unnecessarily. And that makes sense of heaven. The good people who've suffered unnecessarily get it's made up to by they get to go to heaven. The bad people who've got away with it on earth, they don't get away with it anymore. They go back to hell. They go to hell and get the suffering they deserve. So that's the sort of retributivist or backwards-looking justification. But also, another justification for punishment is deterrence. Deterrents say we punish people as an incentive to others not to do good. Not to do evil. So that's forward-looking. The reason why you punish people is to make the world to come better. You say, okay, we're going to prevent future murders by punishing murderers now and saying, hey, look, this is what will happen to you if you murder, so that stops murders happening. That's the deterrence idea of punishment. And you can see a sort of forward-looking justification for heaven and hell is people knowing that if they're good, they'll go to heaven, and if they're bad, they'll go to hell, will behave accordingly. So knowing that hell yawns below them if they do bad is an incentive to be good. So that's a problem for universalism. If you remove hell, then it seems like in some sense you're removing justice because Hitler gets away with it. And also you're removing an incentive to do good because you can be the worst person in the world and still go to heaven. So why be good? But finally, if the sort of pushback against the value of heaven and hell as incentives is nicely illustrated by a Muslim, specifically Sufi saint called Rabi'a al-Adawiyya, sometime in the Middle Ages. I can't remember the dates. But famously, she ran through the town. This is the story. She ran through the town with a bucket of water in one hand and a torch in the other, flaming torch. And when asked why she was doing this, she said the bucket of water is to put out the flames of hell, and the flaming torch is to set fire to heaven. Why? She was asked, and she said, essentially she said, because they're perverse incentives, and that shouldn't be the reason you love God. You shouldn't love God because you're scared of going to hell. You don't really love God then. You shouldn't love God because you want to go into heaven. That's what my gran used to call cupboard love. You know, if you love your gran because she gives you cookies, that's not real love. So Rabi'a al-Adawiyya disapproved of the idea of hell and heaven as incentives, and she said they cheapened and devalued the pure love that you should have for God. None of this is discussed by Walls, but these are other issues that are brought up about heaven and hell. Okay, so the proportionality problem. What do people who want to defend some kind of version of hell, what do they say? Well, the thing that they tend to point to is this idea of libertarian freedom. Now, I should stress, when the word libertarian is used in this context, it doesn't mean the political sense. The political sense that we're used to is libertarians are in favor of a minimal state and are opposed to taxation. They think taxation is theft. They're crazy. You can ignore those people. The one thing that they're good for is that they're in favor of legalizing drugs, because you should have essentially as much freedom as is compatible with not hurting the freedom of others. That's the political sense of libertarian. That's not what this is. Libertarian conception of freedom is this idea that even God cannot determine what you do if you have libertarian freedom. This is the idea of freedom that is necessary for the free will defense against the problem of evil to work. Because if you remember, the free will defense says, all the evil in the world isn't God's fault. Well, whose fault is it? It's the fault of mostly humans, all free beings, because God cannot make you do something and also be free. So libertarian freedom means you're doing something completely undetermined, either by your nature or your genetics or your environment or whatever. Now, this is a big debate in philosophy, and probably the mainstream view in philosophy is that libertarian freedom does not make sense. Libertarian freedom is not real freedom, because what the critics who are compatibilists say about libertarian freedom is that if what you do has nothing to do with your personality, because after all, your personality is formed by your genetics and your environment. It's not actually chosen by you. It's how you're raised, how your biology is. That's what determines your personality. If that's what determines what you do, then you are not free in the libertarian sense. To be free in the libertarian sense, the things you do must be undetermined by your character. Well, say the compatibilists, that just sounds like randomness. It's like you could be walking down the street and suddenly find yourself stabbing someone, and you wouldn't know why. You would have no reason for it. Because if you had a reason, it would be your beliefs and desires, which are part of your personality, which is not under your control. So libertarian freedom, according to its critics, just sounds like randomness, things that happen to you. And certainly it doesn't have the moral weight that all of its defenders put on it. However, the libertarian freedom, how is that supposed to justify hell? Well, it does it in this way. It does it by saying that actually those people in hell are not being forced in there by God. They've chosen to go there. And therefore, any punishment they get, even if they're there for all eternity, is their choice, and God can't be blamed for it. So it's a lot like the free will defense of suffering on earth that says, any suffering we get is our fault, not God's. It's the same idea here. So Jonathan Quanvig gives the issuant conception of hell, where he says that, because actually Quanvig makes a big point of saying there's an intellectual problem in Christianity, because the justification for hell is usually justice. You're there to be punished. Whereas the justification for heaven is love. And these are not necessarily two consistent notions. Because after all, a judge should exhibit justice and not love, whereas a parent should exhibit love and not justice. You don't kill your kids if they've done something bad, because you love them and forgive them. So you get into heaven because of God's love, you get into hell because of God's justice, but those are inconsistent justifications. He says, on my conception, you're in both places because of God's love. How can you be in hell because of love? This is a bit like being beaten and being told this hurts me more than it hurts you. That was always a lie. His explanation is, God is honoring your choice. You have libertarian freedom. You get to choose your ultimate destiny. In fact, if God put you somewhere without you choosing, that would destroy your autonomy. That would undercut your freedom. So it's a good thing that he is honoring your choice by giving you heaven or hell. According to Quanvig, hell can be either annihilation or eternal existence. Now, but you're not being punished there. You're just separate from hell. So you are experiencing pain, but it's not the pains of sense. You're not being burnt and poked with pitchforks. You're just not with God. So it's the pain of loss. You could be having it so much better. You might not even realize that you're suffering because you don't know what it's like to be in heaven. So that's what hell is. It's just separation from God. Charles Seymour gives a similar view, except that he does allow that there is actual suffering of sense in hell. You can be punished. The reason why you stay in hell is still your fault. You're choosing to continue to sin. Both of them reject number 3. Both of them think that you can get out of hell. So both of them think that hell is not permanent, necessarily. It will be permanent for some who make that choice, who reject God. The only people in hell permanently are those who continually reject God. At any point, they could get out of hell by choosing to accept God. So it's their own stubbornness that keeps them there, so you can't blame God for it. So there's no proportionality problem because God is not punishing them disproportionately. God is just honoring their choices and is forever giving them the chance of parole or the chance to get out. Like in the Bible, apparently, the one time in the Bible when there was escape is called the harrowing of hell, which is in the 3 days between Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection, when, according to the Bible, he goes down to hell and preaches to some people in hell and springs them from hell. So some people have got out of hell, according to the Bible, which seems to imply that hell already exists, which is inconsistent with the idea I talked about earlier. But consistency is not always a strong point of religions. All right, so you get the basic idea why libertarian freedom is supposed to solve the proportionality problem. So another response to the proportionality problem is, again, by Christian writers, so this is within the Christian tradition. Because, of course, one response to the proportionality problem is to say, it's all bullshit. There is no heaven and hell. But if you think of the afterlife as a necessary part of Christianity and you want to defend some consistent version of it, then you have to respond to this problem. So these are two also Christian writers, Marilyn Adams and Thomas Talbot, and they argue for slightly different variations of universalism, which again is this idea that everybody ends up in heaven. Everybody ends up in heaven. Presumably, universalism is consistent with people spending some time in hell, but they have to all eventually end up in heaven. The previous views we looked at, like Van Vig's and Seymour's, it was entirely possible that people never ended up in heaven because they continued to choose to be apart from God. Marilyn Adams is arguing against these views, like Van Vig and Seymour, which she refers to as mild hell, because they're not the traditional idea of hell where you are punished. These mild hells, Van Vig and Seymour reject this idea of misery and punishment as pains of sense, like literal torture. Mild hell rejects that idea. And she says, not only is she opposed to the punishment model because of the proportionality problem, but she doesn't think Van Vig and Seymour solved the proportionality problem with their mild hell, because she thinks they overvalue this idea of libertarian freedom. This is like what I was saying earlier. The compatibilists say that freedom, that kind of freedom isn't valuable at all. It's just randomness. She doesn't say that, but she does say, think of it this way. If you're a parent and most parents want to respect their kids' choices. If their kids choose particular dolls that they want for Christmas, they don't say, no, you shouldn't have dolls, you should have this. I'm going to get you dirt for Christmas because it's good for you. Those would be shitty parents. If you love your kids, you want to respect their choices even when they're little, within reason. If they choose to jump off the top of the roof, then you say, well, that freedom should not be respected and is not valuable enough. You are not doing anything wrong in not respecting that freedom. And essentially, she says the size gap between God and us is like the size gap in terms of understanding of the world and view of what is best for everybody. The size gap between humans and God is like infinitely larger than that between parents and child. So if God says, no, you shouldn't choose to be apart from me, it's not good for you, and sort of coerces people to avoid hell, then that is only right and proper. So her view is that God is right to basically funnel us all into heaven. Because the mild hell defenders like Van Vig and Seymour say, if God forced us into heaven and didn't give us the choice of hell, that wouldn't respect our freedom. And she says that this is a silly thing to value. That's like respecting the freedom of your child to play on the freeway. No, you shouldn't respect that. So that's her response. Thomas Talbot offers a slightly more complicated response, composed of three main claims. First of all is that real freedom, the kind that you should value. So for example, why don't we necessarily value children's choices? So here's a case. If a kid gets hold of a credit card and orders things over the phone, we are not legally required to honor that purchase because the child's choice is not considered legally binding. Why? Because they don't know what they're doing. Same reason why children don't go to prison, or at least they shouldn't, because they are not yet, their choice is not yet fully informed. And this is the point that Thomas Talbot is making here. Real freedom requires full information and no regrets. That's the kind of choice that is valuable and should be respected. But that's never going to happen. No genuine, real freedom is going to end up in a permanent choice of hell. So there's, whereas the mild hell defenders, Talbot and Seymour, say God's got to allow hell to exist because otherwise he's not respecting our freedom, Talbot is saying no, the kind of freedom that should be respected will never end up in hell, because hell is forcibly imposed punishment, and it just, this is a slightly distinct point, but we will never end up. We are not psychologically capable of choosing to endure punishment for all eternity. We are just not capable of that. So Thomas Talbot argues for necessary universalism. Necessarily, we cannot choose freedom in the correct sense of freedom. We will never end up choosing. It just wouldn't happen. The kind of scenario that the mild hell advocates suggest, where somebody could end up forever choosing to be apart from God, given, well, first of all, he argues that there is actually real pains of sense involved in hell, and in support of this, he cites biblical passages that talk about hell being a place of actual suffering, and he says we are not capable of choosing that. Okay, now in response to this, obviously Walls is not a universalist. He argues that hell does exist. He says, well, it sounds like this is Walls talking to Talbot, it sounds like in defining hell this way, you are making it sound like God is forcing sinners to essentially turn to heaven. And that's not right. That's going against their freedom. That's going against both their power and their psychological capacity. People don't have the power, which is the part that is related to freedom. This distinction, by the way, he says, is based on something that Augustine says. Augustine says, this is actually another philosophical puzzle. Are people in heaven free? I mentioned this when I was talking about the free will defense. Are people in heaven free? If they're free, then if you believe the free will defense, people who are genuinely free will inevitably choose evil. And yet people in heaven never choose evil. How can they be free in heaven and never choose evil if on earth freedom inevitably brings evil? And Augustine's attempt to answer this is that they are free in the sense that they have the power to sin. It's just that they are psychologically incapable because they are so overawed by the goodness of God. But having the power is enough to make them free. What Walls is saying is that on this definition of hell, people wouldn't even have the power. It's like if you torture someone, they don't have the power to resist it. Humans are just built that way. So this sounds like God is effectively forcing people into heaven, and that is violating their freedom. Now, Marilyn Adams presumably wouldn't have a problem with this, but Talbot wants to say that even in respecting humans' freedom, God essentially funnels them into heaven inevitably. And then they get into a debate where Talbot says, well, it's not God forcing them because their suffering is in some sense self-inflicted. And he gives this example of the foolish philanderer. It sounds a bit like the plot of Fatal Attraction, except a bit more extreme. In Fatal Attraction, Michael Douglas has an affair, who's married, has an affair with Glenn Close, and she turns out to be crazy. And she boils his kid's bunny. And in this version, he killed the crazy woman. It's always a crazy woman, isn't it? It's never a wife having an affair with a crazy man. But anyway, kills this guy's wife and child. And this causes him eternal suffering. But the suffering is self-caused. It's not God forcing him. And that's what the suffering of hell is like. So you're being forced into heaven not by God, this suggests, but by kind of your own conscience. But Walls doubts that would be enough. That, people go easy on themselves and it wouldn't be the kind of overwhelming suffering that would be enough to force them into heaven. So if that, either God is forcing them, in which case that's cheating, he's ignoring their freedom, or, this is Walls' criticism, or if the suffering is self-inflicted, it wouldn't be enough to force people into heaven. So that's Walls' critique. All right, that's hell. Hell gets a lot more debate than heaven for some reason, but there are interesting problems about heaven, and they talk about 3 of them, and I've added a 4th of my own. So let's look at the 3 that Walls discusses. First, the problem of how can you be happy in heaven given that people are suffering in hell? Obviously, this problem is solved if you're a universalist. So this problem is only a problem if hell exists. Think of it this way. Suppose you get into heaven, but the rest of your family doesn't. Because let's face it, your family's terrible. You know it. And they're going to hell, right? We all know that. They're going to be down in hell while you're up in heaven. Can you be happy? Because you know that they're in hell for all eternity suffering. How can you be fully happy? Now, this is raised by Schleiermacher, which is a great name, and he suggests is that eternal damnation of any is incompatible with salvation of any, because if you're saved, you're saintly, and you feel the suffering of others. You have full empathy. So of course you're going to suffer the same as the people in hell, because you suffer for them, you empathize with them, and therefore you can't be happy in heaven. Responses, and these seem, I don't know, a lot of these make the people in heaven sound like complete assholes, but here we go. Suggested solution to this problem. The blessed in heaven are too happy to be disturbed. It's like, this is like drug addicts not noticing that their babies are dying, because they're too blissed out. It doesn't paint a good picture of the people in heaven. So there's that one. The blessed in heaven see the nature of evil with such clarity that they're at peace with the damnation. They're saying to the people in hell, you know what you did, Mom. You know you did wrong, so, you deserve this, right? And then you go away whistling up in heaven. Another suggestion is the blessed in heaven are just simply not aware of it. God sort of walls them off. What happened to my mom? Oh, don't worry about Mom, says God. Okay, goes off whistling again. Again, I don't think it paints a good picture of the people in heaven. The worst one is suggested. This is actually suggested by Jonathan Edwards, who was a very influential early American Christian theologian. And he says that actually the people in heaven will have well, he didn't put it this way, but you could put it this way, will have giant view screens and will watch and exult in the suffering of those in heaven because they know that it's God's justice, and they find pleasure in the greatness of the justice of God. So they will actually watch people being tortured in hell, and it will make them even happier. Seems a bit sick to me. Okay, so that's a puzzle. Now, what's Walls' solution? Well, I'm just going to read it aloud to you because I don't find it that convincing, but here is what he says. He says, but even if contemporary believers cannot identify with any of the sentiments that I suggested, they may still feel that there is something profoundly wrong with the notion that hell should have any claim against heaven, that hell should have veto power over the joy of the redeemed, Think of Jesus' parable of the prodigal who returns, Luke 15:25-32, the prodigal son. The older brother refuses to come in to celebrate. I always identified with the older brother, I got to say. But why should the party stop simply because some refuse to enter the banquet hall? What's he saying? He's saying, suppose there are some people who say, I can't enjoy myself in heaven because my mom's down in hell being punished for all eternity. And he's saying, why should the party stop for that? And he literally says party pooper. God cannot be held captive by such party poopers. Somebody who objects to people being tortured is a party pooper, apparently. Okay. Party pooper and spoil sport. While we have the right to sit it out, we have the right to not be happy in heaven, we don't have the right to hold up the joyous celebration of God's redeeming love by all who have accepted it. So he just doesn't see it as a problem. People shouldn't people should be able to party in heaven and ignore the suffering of those in hell. Another criticism of heaven is that the history of the idea is kind of shady. It has a shady historical pedigree. That is, the idea of heaven is kind of it was designed as a reward to the faithful, and it's essentially saying, you're going to be, ignore all these people, they're going to suffer for all eternity. So it's very much tied to the idea that the people rewarded in heaven are of the right religion. So it's basically saying, good will come to you and yours, and those other people, they're going to suffer. It's discriminatory. It's discriminatory in its very nature. God is showing favoritism and prejudice. As Walls points out, maybe it had a suspect origin, but actually he says that you can trace the origin in Jewish thought to the idea of justice, which again is a very powerful reason for wanting there to be heaven and hell to balance out the injustices that we see on earth. But it's worth noting that if you're saying that the justification for heaven and hell is justice, that doesn't fit with the contemporary Christian justification for heaven, which is God's love rather than God's justice. The third one he mentions is the idea that heaven will be tedious. He doesn't go into this in much detail, but one of the main proponents of this idea, or a very influential work that brings up this problem, is by a guy called Bernard Williams, who is a very well-respected late 20th century British philosopher. Bernard Williams, and it's called the Macropolis case. And he gets that title from a Czech play by one of the writers, I think it's one of the writers who invented the term robot, Capek. There were a pair of brothers who wrote a series of plays in the early 20th century. One of them was the first use of the word robot, which is actually a Czech word. Did you know that? The word robot comes from the Czech language, and it means drudge or sort of servant. And they basically coined the term for mechanical people. But they also wrote another play about this woman called Macropolis, who it turned out her father, over 300 years ago, discovered basically the fountain of youth, or an eternal youth potion, and she'd been taking it for hundreds of years. But eventually she just gets bored, and she stops taking it and would rather die. There's also a children's book, a very good children's book. I've forgotten who wrote it, but it's called Tuck Everlasting. And this has very much the same idea, that the protagonist runs into a family that has been around for forever, but eventually they decide they don't want to do it anymore. They're bored. So the idea that eternal existence would be boring. Isn't it? I must admit, I never finished The Good Place, but I think at the end of The Good Place, don't they opt for oblivion? And this might be on a similar, sorry if that's a spoiler. I don't know this for fact, so don't take take my word for it, but if you've seen it, maybe you'll know. Bernard Williams's actual argument was that you have two options. It was a dilemma. Either you'll get bored, or, so suppose in response to that, so you picture yourself in heaven and you think, great, I get to live forever. I get to do all the things I want to do. I get to climb Mount Everest. I get to travel to Alpha Centauri. Remember, even if this takes you millions of years, that's literally nothing in the big picture, because any finite number is as nothing to infinity. So you can travel to the edges of the universe and back 1,000,000 times, and you still will have not lived the smallest fraction of your existence. So anything you could possibly imagine, you can do 1,000,000 times over and still have infinity in front of you. You would picture getting bored, I imagine. Now, he says, in response to this, I am reminded of that religious show I saw on TV once where a woman was saying, if you like quiet, I don't know if I said this in a previous video, but I lived in Arkansas once and I saw this religious channel on TV, and this woman was saying, if you like quiet, you're going to hate heaven, because heaven is going to be 10,000 people yelling hallelujah at the top of their lungs 24/7. And at the time I thought, well, there goes my last incentive to be good, because that sounds like hell to me. But suppose in response somebody says, but you say that now, but when you get to heaven, you'll love that. That's one of the effects of going to heaven, is that you suddenly get it. You say, oh, I get it. I understand. All I want to do now is play my harp and praise God. Just that's all I want to do. That will make me happy permanently. Suppose that's what happened. Well, Bernard Williams says that would be a way to avoid boredom. And in fact, it's the only way to avoid boredom, and it's to lose your identity. That would no longer be you. I mean, you looking up and saying and seeing this person just going, for infinity, you would say, who's that? Who's that? That's not me. I don't identify with that person at all. So he says, either you will be so bored you're begging for suicide. Eventually, maybe it'll take some people longer than others. Or if you're not bored, that'll be because it's no longer you, and in effect, you don't survive. If that person is literally not you, then you no longer exist. There's just somebody who looks like you, who used to be you, but is no longer you. You're gone. And that's not the idea of heaven. The idea of heaven is that you continue to exist for all eternity. And this idea of identity we'll get into in a bit more in the next video. But that's the idea. Now, usually the defenders of heaven say, I don't get it. I just don't believe you. I won't get bored. Maybe you'd get bored. I'm not going to get bored. That's the usual response. Finally, perverse incentives. Think of universalism. Universalism says two things. First of all, heaven is wonderful. Heaven is so much better than this. Heaven, this is, our life is an existence we have to trudge through to get to the reward of heaven. As people say, don't feel bad for Grandpa, he's in a better place. Why? Because he's in heaven, and it's better than this shithole, right? So we're taught that. Now, if we're also universalists, then that means whatever you do, you're going to heaven. So kill yourself, right? Things will immediately get better than you. If you have a headache, kill yourself. Why not? You're going to go to heaven, and you'll never have a headache again. And it's like the best thing ever. You don't know how good it could be. Even if you think you're doing well on earth, kill yourself, and you'll find out, hey, that was nothing to how good heaven is. That's kind of a perverse incentive. Now, usually, this was actually a problem in the Middle Ages, people killing themselves to go to heaven. And some people suggest that's why we get the idea that suicide is a way to send yourself to hell. You don't get to go to heaven if you commit suicide, because that's cheating. Now, of course, the problem is, why shouldn't you go to heaven? So the problem is, what's the point of earth? Well, the point of earth is to be a testing place. But look, if I do something wrong on this, remember, effectively 0% of my existence, I get punished for all eternity. Isn't it better to get out as soon as possible? So actually, even if universalism is not true, you should certainly kill your children, right? Because if you let your children live, there's a chance they'll do something wrong and they'll end up in hell. But if you kill them before they have a chance to sin, they'll get to go to heaven. It's the best thing you could do for them. Maybe you'll go to hell because you killed your children, but you know, it's worth it for them. It's the ultimate altruistic act, is to kill your children before they can sin. Why not? Isn't that what heaven, isn't that the obvious rational conclusion to reach if you believe in heaven? And if you believe in heaven, what's the point of earth? Now, so here's what cynics would say. Only people on earth would invent the idea of heaven and hell. If really heaven and hell existed, they would never invent earth. There's no point to earth. The only point to heaven and hell, the only point to earth is if earth is all that actually really exists, and we invent heaven and hell to make life on earth seem bearable. You know, yes, life sucks here. You know, like famously, Marx's interpretation of heaven and hell, or he said of religion, religion is the opiate of the masses. And this is tied to the notions of the afterlife. Opiate literally is a painkiller, but also it is a mind number. It's a painkiller. Religion is a painkiller because life is so shitty on earth, we need to be told that things are going to get better after we die. So we believe in heaven. We believe in heaven and hell. And that's why he said in communism, religion will die out, because in communism, life will be great on earth, and we won't need heaven and hell. We won't need the painkiller anymore because we won't be suffering. But certainly, if you take the existence, if you truly believe that you're going to heaven, why not kill yourself? Why not get there faster? Why hang around in this shithole, right? It's a veil of tears. It says that in the Bible. It's a veil of tears. Why not take the shortcut? That's a problem. If you think people killing themselves is a bad thing, then that's the problem to heaven, because it does seem to create that incentive. There you go.